All right, Henry VIII and England's break with Rome. Its initial break, because it's not a complete break, but it's the first break with Rome. So the story really for us begins with Catherine. You remember I said that Henry VII arranged for his eldest son, Arthur, to marry a Spanish princess. And this is she, Catherine of Aragon. Now, if Arthur hadn't died when he was 15 years old, well, history might be very different from the way it is now. But he did die, and then in 1502, his brother became heir to the throne. And Arthur had married Catherine 6 months before dying, and then after Arthur died, plans were made for her to marry Henry, who was the remaining brother. Well, there were problems. One of the problems was the question of the dowry. Dowry was money that the woman's family would give on marriage. In other words, women would pay, the families of a woman, the family of a woman would pay for her to have a husband. They would pay money to the husband's family. This money was called a dowry. Well, Henry only paid half of it. At the time that Arthur died, he hadn't paid the entire amount. But after Henry was betrothed to Catherine, in other words, after they were engaged to be married, the agreement was that they were going to marry when he was 15, but this money, this dowry, was still a problem. It hadn't been paid, or half of it hadn't been paid. Well, normally, marriage to a husband's brother was forbidden by the church, so this is another step that had to be taken. Is it okay to marry, my dead brother's wife? We'll be looking at the question of what the Bible says about this and what the actual Christian teaching was about this, but the normal thing to do in this situation, especially for a high-class person, for a king, person from the royal family, would be to ask the Pope. The Pope is the Romaho. What do you say? Is it okay? All right, we're not sure if it's okay. Please, will you allow us to do this? So the Pope said, yes, there's no problem. And also, Catherine herself said, Arthur was sick. Arthur was ill right from the beginning. He wasn't able to we never had sex. We never slept together. He was too ill. The marriage was not consummated. Again, that would be an important point. If the marriage had not been consummated, then according to church law, it wasn't really a marriage. So again, that would be another reason to say that it's okay for Catherine to marry the brother, Henry. And the Pope did indeed give permission in 1505 for Henry and Catherine to be married. Catherine's mother had died in the meantime. Isabella of Spain, Queen of Spain, had died in the meantime, and she didn't have a male heir. She didn't have a son, which pulled Catherine's value down, because it meant that in the end, probably her parents' rule over Spain would end when her father died, so that she would no longer be a royal Spanish princess, because that royal family was going to die out because they didn't have a son. So that decreased her value, so her father is sort of saying, I don't think the dowry should be so much, I don't think I can pay that much for her. And so the two fathers are kind of arguing about the dowry. And just when it seems that it's never going to happen, the marriage is going to have to be called off, the father, Henry VII, dies. Henry VIII's father dies, and within a few weeks, he and Catherine get married. She was a remarkable woman, and Henry At least, when he married her, he probably knew how remarkable she was, because he said that it was his father's dying wish that they should get married. That's what he told people. But since the father seems to have been against the marriage from the beginning, I think historians mostly feel that probably he just made that up. Okay? Just to smooth the way for himself to marry Catherine. His father probably never said any such thing. And you can see, her independence during those difficult years after her husband died, and up until the time when she married Henry, she had to sell off her jewellery because she had to eat, so she had to sell off her jewellery because her father wasn't supporting her. The royal family in England wasn't supporting her. She had to learn how to look after herself in a situation where she was, as I say, little more than a prisoner, really, in England during those years. But she showed that she was really good at, for example, diplomacy, like being an ambassador. She was the first female ambassador in Europe when there was nobody else to help with diplomatic relations with Spain. Catherine stepped in, and she was an outstanding woman in that respect. And also, culturally, she's important as being one of the shining lights in this humanist movement, this sort of new kind of Christian philosophy that was based on softening the strict teaching of the Christian religion and introducing many more sort of philosophical and ethical aspects. It would be another topic, really, to talk about humanism, so I won't get into the whole topic, but I will say that she was in contact with and friends with some of the major thinkers, philosophers of her day, Erasmus in Europe, in England Thomas More, and also in England the Spanish philosopher VIII, who was the tutor to her daughter. Remember, she was Spanish, and her daughter was brought up with a Spanish tutor. And also interesting, from that Spanish tutor, VIII, he wrote a book called The Institution of a Christian Woman, which was the first book that had ever been written on women's education. That's the kind of thing that the humanists would be looking at, things like women's education, that kind of topic. Well, the only thing that Catherine really got wrong was not having a son. She had a daughter, Mary, but she didn't have a son, not one that survived anyway. And once it became clear that she was too old to have any more children, Henry started looking around for a way to end the marriage and find somebody else that he could have a son with. He didn't have the idea that the daughter, Mary, might become queen, although in fact she did. And he had another daughter, Elizabeth, who also became queen. But it wasn't really the idea in those days that a woman would become queen on her own, and so he wanted to have a son to make sure that his family would be sort of stable and continue to rule the country after his death. So this opens up a whole can of worms, and we have to look at something called the annulment. Now, we saw that Henry's marriage was created in a special way because he was the brother of her former husband. And special permission was got from the Pope to do it and everything. Now, what Henry now wanted to do was to say that should never have happened. So he's getting interested in this, what would you call a lady in waiting, a sort of very, very high-class servant in the court of those days. Mary Boleyn, firstly, and then after Mary, her sister Anne Boleyn. And so he he had an affair with Mary, but Anne was not prepared to have an affair with him. For her, it was going to be marriage or nothing. She wouldn't be his mistress. And so Henry now goes to the Pope and says, look, you gave permission for me to marry my brother's wife, but according to the Bible, you shouldn't have done that. You know, this marriage should never really have happened. It was wrong. And probably because it was wrong, you know, the Bible says that if you do such a thing, you won't have children. Because it's then that's why I can't have a son, isn't it? You know, you made a mistake right back there in the beginning. You should never have let this marriage happen. So people often talk about his divorce. But it was more than a divorce. He wanted to say that the marriage had never really happened. An annulment. It had been a mistake from the beginning. It should never have been allowed. So he wanted, not a divorce, which was not allowed in those days. He wanted an annulment, which means to say that the marriage was nothing, that it never really was a marriage. As it says in Leviticus, if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an impurity. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness, and they shall be childless. And so he's now bringing that up and saying, look, you see, it's true. I can't have a son. And as long as she hasn't given me a son. He ignored the fact that he did have a daughter, because that didn't really count, as far as he was concerned. So he used these words from the Bible to try to argue that the marriage should be declared null, declared never to have happened. Well, he expected that the Pope was going to agree with him, but unfortunately for him, and for history, I suppose, in a way, the Pope didn't agree to annul the marriage. He said the verse applied only when the brother was still alive. It wouldn't apply to a dead brother. And we'll look at afterwards and see that he had a good reason for saying that. And Catherine is continuing to insist that the marriage had never been consummated, in which case, she had never really been Henry's brother's wife, so the marriage was okay. So the Pope and Catherine were both in agreement. There's no problem with this marriage. This marriage is a marriage. It's a legal marriage. And the Pope, of course, was friendly with Catherine's family, with Ferdinand and so on. He wasn't going to make an agreement against Catherine. So Henry's disappointed, left on his own. Nobody's going to support him. The Pope isn't going to support him in ending his marriage to his wife. So what does Henry do? Well, he goes to an English court. He says, let's forget about the Pope. Let's forget about what he says. And let's have a court of good, loyal English people, men who agree with me and will do what I tell them, and who wouldn't. I mean, anybody would do what Henry told them, because if you didn't do what he told you, he'd chop your head off. So they agreed with him, and they declared his marriage null. And in fact, he'd already gone through a marriage ceremony with Anne a few months previously, and that was declared valid a few days after the previous marriage to Catherine was declared null. So under English law, Henry was now married to Anne Boleyn. And accordingly, the Pope issued what's called a bull of excommunication. It means he was kicked out of the Catholic Church. The Pope said, you can't do that. You've completely gone against what I said, and I'm the authority here, and even though you're a king, you can't do that. And Henry says, well, I did do it. I've done it. So the Pope says, well, in that case, you are no longer a Catholic. You are out. Okay? You're out of our church. So this is the beginnings of what we call, in England, the Reformation. The English Reformation has its beginnings quite simply because Wagamama Osama wants to have a son, wants to have a second wife. It's not to do with religion. In terms of religion, Henry believed the same as the Catholics. He wasn't like the Protestants. He didn't disagree with the church. He just wanted to leave Catherine and marry Anne. And so, for that reason, he broke his church away from, he broke England, and the English church was now separate from the Catholic Church in Rome. In 1534, Henry was declared the supreme head of the Church of England. Sorry, I need a better background there. He was declared the leader of the Church of England, and that was the central turning point. In 1529, it had all sort of started, that Henry had started wanting to separate from his wife, Catherine, and the process also led to England separating itself from the Catholic Church in Rome. And it happened step by step over a period of about 8 years, starting in 1529 and ending in 1537. Okay, so it's not just a question of a king separating from his wife, it's a question of England separating from the Catholic Church, the Church of Rome. And it was kind of a coincidence, just by chance really, that at the same time as Henry is having this disagreement with the Pope about his wife, there's a big argument growing up in Europe about the church, the Catholic Church itself. So you've probably heard of this man Martin Luther from Germany. He very famously put up 95 different points in which he said, look, the church says this, but the Bible says this. The church says this, but the Bible says this. The church says this, and the Bible says something different. All right? Now, the language of the Bible at this time would be, what language would people be able to read the Bible in at this time? Latin, absolutely. The language of the Bible was Latin, and ordinary people, at first we've seen they couldn't afford to buy a book, and the Bible was a huge book. It would be much more expensive than other books. Many people couldn't read. Latin was not taught to poor people, to ordinary people, so they couldn't. A lot of people didn't have a very clear sense of what was written in the Bible. So when Luther came along and said very clearly, the Bible says this and the church is doing something different, then it led to a big sort of social revolution, with lots of people saying, have we been tricked? Is the church been tricking us all this time? Okay, now the church was getting comfortably rich in various ways. And we'll look at, some of those ways, but the big thing that was really upsetting people was that people were paying money to the church thinking that they could get to heaven more easily. And there's nothing in the Bible that says you can buy your way into heaven. All right? So all through Europe, there was a kind of revolution of thinking, and we call this Protestant thinking, the Protestant church, the Reformation. Well, funnily enough, Henry totally disagreed with the Protestants. He disagreed with Luther, and he basically agreed with the Catholic Church in every way. He was called Fidei Defensor, defender of the faith. When he wrote a book against Luther in 1521, the Pope was very happy with Henry. They were friends at this time. After breaking with Rome, Henry had to make a few compromises because the Protestant reformers were saying, "Come on, look, you've broken. You're not connected with Rome. You're more on the Catholic. You're more on the Protestant side now. You're not on the Catholic side anymore." So he had to make one or two compromises. One compromise was that he let the Bible be translated into English. He had actually burned a man for translating the Bible into English only 3 years before, but now he basically was pushed into allowing the Bible to be translated into English. Okay, William Tyndale was burned in 1536 for translating the Bible into English. Only 3 years later, Henry was saying, oh, okay, then you can translate the Bible into English. He was forced, really, by circumstances to compromise on that point. And, Tyndale's dying words were, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. Well, I wouldn't exactly say his eyes were opened 3 years later. It's just that he was forced. He didn't really have much choice. He had to make some sort of compromise at that stage. So the Great Bible was published at Henry's command. It was called the Great Bible because it was a great big book. It was a huge thing. It was supposed to be chained up in the church. Every church was supposed to have a copy chained up there so it couldn't be taken away by anybody. And the Bible was there for everybody to read in English. Now, the other big thing that Henry did at this time was to get rid of all the monasteries. Okay, these had been housing monks and nuns for hundreds of years, and he closed them down over a 5-year period. One of Shakespeare's sonnets talks about their ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang, which seems to be lamenting the loss of this ancient culture. Closing the monasteries was, for Henry, economically, it brought him in a lot of money. The lands of the monasteries now became the lands of the crown. The possessions of the monasteries became the possessions of the crown. And Henry was able to use them to kind of bribe people. He would say, well, you know, if you support me, if you cooperate with me, I'll give you this piece of land, I'll give you this piece, you know, huge wealth that he was able to pass out among his, high-class elite members of society in order to get their cooperation. And, well, some of the actual monks and nuns themselves left England, but most of them stayed behind. Some of them were given a pension, some of them became priests. Of course, the nuns couldn't because they weren't allowed to become priests, but the monks did. They weren't allowed to marry. They continued not being allowed to marry until after Henry died. And the buildings themselves were either destroyed or left in ruins. As you can see here, now this is, most of these are English monasteries. One or two of them are from other areas, but most of them are English monasteries. And as Shakespeare said, these ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. The sweet birds meaning the choirs that would sing the religious music in these ruined buildings, which still stand all over England as a sort of reminder of that period. Okay, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. And you can just see some of them here. Okay, all over England, all over Europe, in fact, because something similar was happening in other parts of Europe, but mostly in England and Wales, because this is really the sort of central thing of Henry's campaign. He got rid of the monasteries. The Catholic monasteries and convents were all destroyed or fell into ruin. Okay. So there you get a sense of just sort of the variety and how many of those buildings are still standing there as a kind of reminder of what what happened at that time. And again, Shakespeare in Henry VIII, part 2, he says, those that can pity here may, if they think it well, let forth a tear. And again, there's some sense that he may have been talking about the ruining of the monasteries, the dissolution of the monasteries. There are some people who say that Shakespeare himself was a Catholic. We may look at that later on. It's a hotly debated point. This university is particularly famous in that debate because of Father Millward, Jesus Kaino Milward Sensei, who is still alive, still writing books about Shakespeare being a Catholic. And you can see him in S.J. House if you're interested. But he's published many books on this topic. I disagree. I've had many debates with him on the topic, but it's an interesting theory. And it's certainly one that's becoming, quite popular. There are quite a number of academics who will say, Shakespeare was a Catholic himself. But that's something, as I say, we may look at that a little bit later on. Okay, so that's more or less it, really, for this stage of Henry's life and the break of the English Church away from Rome. I've put here that many of the convents and monasteries had fallen into corrupt ways, and that there was quite a lot of popular disagreement with the whole system of monasteries. And there is some truth in that, but I think perhaps I should also have emphasized the other side of the question, which is, where did education come from? The monasteries. Where did healthcare come from? The monasteries. Where did charity come from? The monasteries. I haven't emphasized that enough on this in this presentation, and I think it needs to be said that a lot of social hardship grew up at this time. The Middle Ages had slowly developed a system that more or less worked. Okay, that a reasonable number, not everybody was getting an education by any means, but there was education going on, and it was going on because of the monasteries. There was healthcare going on because they acted as hospitals. There was charity for the poor, and then suddenly it was all swept away. And you get a lot more social deprivation going on in the early modern period than you actually had a century earlier. So in some ways, it's not a step forward. It's a in terms of social structure, in some ways it's a step backwards.